All right, God bless you. Good day to you. Welcome to the Shepherd's Chapel. Welcome to this Family Bible Study Hour. Praise God, we've been waiting on you. Hey, we're ready to fly right back into this Word of our fathers to understand the key to David. That key that unlocks the Scriptures, but also it unlocks life itself to you, letting you know how to deal with certain individuals, to operate under certain conditions, while you do our Father's work and please Him and receive His blessings. We had closed in the last lecture with Absalom being caught by his hair in an oak tree. Now, I'm sure all of you know what an oak tree is symbolic of, what it symbolizes. And within that, you understand God was saying just a little bit, remember who's in charge. For an oak is used as an analogy or an idiom to represent strength. And of course, the strong one is always God. So let there be no doubt in your mind who it was that grabbed the boy by the hair of the head and hung him in the air. Our father was very unhappy with him. He had self-appointed him his position. He was on strictly an ego trip. And David had sent forth an army saying, kill whoever you have to and must, but don't kill Absalom. And Absalom, though he was his firstborn, it's important that you know that, was his firstborn, was his enemy. He was the one that got on the ego trip to start with that has caused many deaths. You might stop and analyze that a little bit as we lay the foundation for the next major point and file mark we make in the key. You don't send an army out and come down on them and praise your enemy, or you won't have an army very long. So poor old David, at his height, the most glorious of warriors, no doubt, as he was that small lad that walked that terrain, climbed that mount, and slew the giant. What a difference years make. What a difference sin makes. For it was his sin that has brought him to this state. And God, walking with him and controlling, reminding him, so let it be a reminder to you, there are certain sins that you pay very heavily for. Certain sins are forgiven like that. But remember, Christ had not paid the price on the cross at this point. But those people, many might say, I wish I could have a closer walk with our Father. Well, just remember this one thing. When you walk as close a walk to our Father as David, who received special instructions from the Father, woe to the man that sins to the degree that David did. You see, Father expects more. Those that have more, He expects more. Those that He chooses and directs, He expects more. Why? Because He expects them to love Him more, therefore He can count on their loyalty, their obedience, and so forth. So, with Absalom hanging by the hair of his head, I would have you remember that old saying, as I remember now I stated in the closing of the last lecture. He shall bruise thy feet, and thou shalt bruise his head. And that oak, that strong oak, grabbed that lad by the head. And we continue with chapter 18, verse 10. We ask a word of wisdom from our Father. Let's roll with it. And a certain man saw it. Saw him hanging in the tree, and told Joab and said, Behold, I saw Absalom hanged in an oak. Verse 11. And Joab said unto the man that told him, And behold, thou sawest him, you saw him hanging there, and why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? And I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver in a girdle. I would have paid you dearly if you would have struck him dead right there. Verse 12, listen to the man. And the man said unto Joab, Though I should receive 1,000 shekels of silver in mine hand, yet would I not put forth mine hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king charged thee, and Abishai, and Ittai, saying, Beware that none touch the young man Absalom. See, that's a hard trip to put on your troops, friend. Think about it. Let it soak in right real good. You see how handicapped they are. 13. Otherwise I should have wrought falsehood against mine own life. For there is no matter hid from the king, and thou thyself wouldest have set thyself against me. Joab was Absalom's cousin. Verse 14. And then said Joab, I may not tarry thus with thee. I'm not going to put up with this. Probably that's a little coarse or hoarse. Let it be. And he took 3 darts in his hand. He took 3 spears and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak, while he was still hanging there by the hair of the head. Joab killed him. And he put all 3 of them right on the mark. There was going to be no chance. This young ego artist had come to the end of his Waterloo, which all people that are self-appointed on an ego trip end up thusly. I don't mean in death, I mean in shame. 15. And 10 young men that bore Joab's armor compassed about and smote Absalom and slew him. They tore him apart. They knew what he had put. They loved David very much. And Joab said, I'm not afraid to kill. Joab was a very wise person. 16. And Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing after Israel, for Joab helped back the people. Do you know what that means? I want you to look into the heart of Joab at this point. These were his own people that were killing each other. That the very jungle that they were fighting in was taking more lives than the spear was. Though he viciously slew Absalom, it was not as the leader of those people that he wanted any of them hurt because of the ego of Absalom. And yes, deep down in his heart, knowing the sin that David committed. For it was this same Joab that David sent the message to take him to the front and abandon him, the one David murdered. Joab knew, but yet as a mighty leader, he cared for the people. It would seem at this time David wasn't worried for the people. He was only worried for Absalom. And Absalom didn't want to hurt any of the people. He wanted to kill David. Therefore, Joab put an end, one and for all times. Verse 17. And they took Absalom and cast him into a great pit in the wood, and laid a very great heap of stones upon him, and all Israel fled every one to his tent. They knew how the king would take this. You know, we see in this that David would be that type, that root from the root of Jesse, through which Christ would come, a son of the living God. And as David, as you would put him as a man after God's own heart, I think you can see in this why God would say a man after my own heart. For God also had 2 sons, as David had 2 sons that I'm specifically going to mention. He had more, but 2 that I will specifically mention. He had Absalom and he had Solomon. Solomon yet a lad, a mere lad at this moment. Absalom was a wicked son, even as Satan to Almighty God in the world that was a wicked son. And within Satan's heart was this pride, ego. That's all. On an ego trip that wouldn't stop. So was Absalom. You know, Let's read another verse. I want you to see a little better, perhaps, view of Absalom. But do you understand where I'm coming from? Many might say, well, that's digression. Well, be that as it may. I want you to see the comparison overall at how God, knowing and observing what's happening, to see the abandonment by Absalom of the love for his own father, to provide authority for himself, that certainly it had to remind him of Satan. Therefore, I think we see the type of Satan inasmuch as he was cast into the pit, even in his burial. Even as Satan will be cast in the pit, as his burial is mentioned in Isaiah 14. I do not believe that our Heavenly Father emotionally could not have helped but note the type, I would say absolute. 18. Now, Absalom, in his lifetime, you listen to this good, had taken and reared up for himself a pillar, which is in the king's dale. Oh, right where the monuments grow, all right? For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name. And it is called unto this day Absalom's place. Or you might say Absalom's hand, better translated from the Hebrew. Do you see what I mean about ego? He built his own monument before he died. And we see a great deal of ego within that. Now, what is the lesson your father wants you to gain from this? Was Absalom that difficult to control? Well, while he wheeled and dealed, with his beauty and the countenance that poured forth from him, his popularity with the nation. But you see, a self-appointed leader on an ego trip is headed for a great fall. Number one, Satan, by flattery and feeding ego, can control someone such as this. Satan can control you today if you're on an ego trip. And what does your father want you to know from this? That even you, in part now, can control a man that is on an ego trip by steering him with flattery that feeds his ego to a point that you want him. Some men have egos for, well, different things. A reputation, a building, a ministry, people that would follow by the millions around the world rather than following Christ. Egos are dangerous, prideful things. I would say that in the story of Absalom, it is made very clear that if a person ever wanted to bring damnation upon oneself, that the ego will do it quicker than anything else, because with an ego you're predictable. Beware of the tools Satan that he uses if you are prone to put yourself on an ego trip. Flattery is the downfall of many a good man. Satan used flattery. Satan was fed by flattery, pride, self-pride. So I only throw that out as a word of caution to you, that everyone, I want to put this back in its perspective. Everyone loves flattery to a point. If they feel if they honestly deserve it, there's nothing wrong with that. But don't ever let it control you. It will take you down. A person that is prone to have his ego fed from flattery alone, for there is one, then he will trip, he will stumble, because it will bring about and bring to pass sin. The reason I'm taking this much time on this, I think it's necessary, because I feel that Absalom died in part to teach this lesson. You might say, well, I can't believe God would allow that to happen to a man. No, that's what the Word's all about, friend. Is so that perhaps there are a few that are wise enough that they can learn by others' mistakes and need not repeat them, because everything that goes around comes around. And you can fall into that same trap. It's so easy. It's so very easy. And some might say, well, how do you handle that? And I do receive a lot of compliments, and they're well meant, I'm sure. I never lose sight of the fact that there's only one thing I teach, chapter by chapter and verse by verse. The Word of my Father. And it is His Word, and He that gets the credit, not a mouthpiece. Not some mouthpiece that simply reads and conveys perhaps the emotion that our Father has within it and the lessons that we should learn. What is there to be prideful of in that? When you love your Father and know that it is His Spirit and His control and His blessings that bring success to a ministry. Man has very little to do with it, if anything, other than being a part of the many-membered body. So, my dear one, let it be a warning to one and all. Do not be prone to let flattery go to your head. Do not be prone to think that great buildings or crowds or something of this nature make or document a man or a woman of God. They don't. They have nothing to do with it. Oh, they're convenient. They're convenient. But I think that's enough said on the subject. And as this type of the false king, or may we say the false Christ, the type that brought forth the satanic influence against David, that he ended in that pit with a heap of stones. And it will not be one of the stones mentioned in the 2nd chapter of Revelation that has a name written on it, perhaps yours, that you earn by doing your Father's Word and taking in the manna, that is to say, His Word, whereby it causes you to mature and to grow, to have self-confidence, and to know who is in charge and who all the praise goes to. Okay, verse 19 as we continue. Then said Ahazmaz, this in the Hebrew tongue, I think I should make it clear, is the brother of anger, because I think well named for the message that must be drawn here or taken back to the king. His firstborn is dead. It was his fast legs that saved David when the force came against him from Absalom. And it will be his legs now that will carry the message back to David that the battle is over, that the sad tidings that his son is dead. 19. Then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, let me now run and bear the king tidings how that the Lord hath avenged him of his enemies. Now this is not going to be glad tidings, all right? 20. And Joab said unto him, thou shalt not bear tidings this day, but thou shalt bear tidings another day. But this day thou shalt bear no tidings, because the king's son is dead. We could amplify that over a certain victory that shall come to pass, that there are certain tidings that must be taken forth, that is to say, witness at the hand of God's elect, that remnant. And it is from the King's Word, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, that one that would come of David, that would bring those tidings. 21. Then said Joab to Cusha, go tell the king what thou hast seen. And Cusha bowed himself unto Joab and ran. Now, Cusha has the article, so it probably means that he was a Cushite or an Ethiopian, that he was a slave. All right. In other words, Joab was very intelligent, and he felt that by sending this stranger, that David would be more forgiving of the troops, and Joab, rightfully as the commander-in-chief, deserves to protect the feelings of the troop, that many have laid their lives down for David. You see, beloved, it's not often that troops go out to fight a war for a king and then have him come down on them for slaying the enemy. Usually there's rejoicing. Do you understand? 22. And then said Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, yet again to Joab, but howsoever, what if it is bad news? Let me, I pray thee, also run after Cushah. And Joab said, wherefore wilt thou run, my son, seeing that thou hast no tidings ready, that you've got no good news, and you shouldn't take what is your hurry to take bad tidings? Being a priest's son, I might add. 23 rather. But howsoever, saith he wouldn't quit. Let me run. He was really known for being this runner anyway, okay? And he said unto them, run then. Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain and overcame Cushite. He's still outran him by going of the way of the plain. A message that shall be delivered by Zerubbabel. Zechariah chapter 4, remember? The witness, the good news that must be carried, that he must run with. And God asked, what is this great mountain that stands before thee? It has become a plain. For those that carry the true message, so it will be. There will be no mount, but it will be plain, and we shall overtake. 24. And David sat between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof over the gate unto the wall, and lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man running alone. Of course, that was the place of the watchman, and he could see this runner in the distance. 25. And the watchman cried and told the king. And the king said, if he be alone, there is tidings in his mouth. And he came apace and drew near. 26. And the watchman saw another man running. And the watchman called unto the porter and said, behold, another man running alone. And the king said, he also bringeth tidings. 27. And the watchman said, methinketh the running of the foremost is like the running of Ahimaaz. Remember, I said he had a reputation for running. The son of Zadok. And the king said, he is a good man, and cometh with good tidings. You see, it was this man, the son of Zadok, that David set up in part of the covert action that he took against Absalom, remember? 28. And Ahimaaz called and said unto the king, all is well. And he fell down to the earth upon his face before the king, and said, blessed be the Lord thy God, which hath delivered up the men that lifted up their hand against my lord the king. You see, this is always good news. Always, when an enemy is defeated. 29. And the king said, is the young man Absalom safe? And Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, and me thy servant, I saw a great tumult, but I knew not what it was. He deliberately sidestepped the issue. That very wise, gallant young man here, he knew that David's love and respect for him as a runner, and as the priest's son, but he deliberately sidestepped, which I think was God's wisdom, inasmuch as stark reality had not come face to face, and yet I have no doubt that David needs no reminder. 30. And the king said unto him, turn aside and stand here. And he turned aside and stood still. He wasn't going to let him go until he got the straight. 31. And behold, Cushi came, and Cushi said, Tidings, my lord the king. For the Lord hath avenged thee this day of all them, got it? All them that rose up against thee. 32. And the king said unto Cushi, Is the young man Absalom safe? And Cushi answered, The enemies of my lord the king, and all that rise against thee to do thee hurt, be as that young man is. They're dead. 33. And the king was much moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate, and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. David could not forget that it was his sin, that God's prophecy concerning his own sin had brought these things to pass. And I know the grief, but yet remember, 2,000 to 20,000 men have died. And David is not mourning his troops or rejoicing in their victory, but he's mourning for the enemy. In their eyes, I want you to understand the overall. The parent's firstborn. And I suppose that it calls for maturity and understanding. For yes, as I mentioned earlier, God himself had 2 sons. And God himself had to sentence one of those sons to death, and to correct for the one son's wickedness, that is to say, Satan, whom he created, Ezekiel 28, yes, don't let it be a big mystery to you, it's written. And to correct the error of the one, he had to let the other die also. Yes, on the cross. So that the sin brought forth by the one in pride and ego, that his love for you could be forgiven. For it was paid for, if you believe, on that cross. And my dear friend, if you believe, and if you have a problem, and if your children cause you worry and concern, then look back upon this and know that, thank God for his tender mercies, he has opened up a way that when you have done all you can do, that you can say, take him in or her into your arms, Father, and he will. He will. Because he loves all of his children, and you know what? You happen to be one of his children. So yes, life is not necessarily a bed of roses or a rose garden or a Garden of Eden because of what happened there. But we can stand that test, and it is his promise that he will never burden you with more than you can bear. You can carry it. You can cut it, friend. If you'll believe in him and know that you're not the only one that has pain. You're not the only one that had to sentence your own son to death. We try to correct our children, yes, and there is sorrow in that. But this is the greater sorrow that our Father himself still bears. That's why it's so important to know his name, El Shaddai, to understand it. This would not be the time to teach it, but you know that I have a tape on El Shaddai explaining that Hebrew name that goes into the very emotions of God for the children that He cherishes. Chapter 19, verse 1. And it was told Joab, Behold, the king weepeth and mourneth for Absalom. And here this great commander-in-chief sees his king, too. And the victory that day was turned into mourning unto all the people. Not a few, all the people, for the people heard say that day how the king was grieved for his son. And the people got them by stealeth, that is, they stealth away, all right, that day into the city, as people being ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. Do you know what happens when you flee in battle? You're a deserter. And the shame was that great upon them that day. But the king covered his face. That is a sign of shame. And the king cried with a loud voice, O my son Absalom! O Absalom, my son, my son! As he cried and went forth. And Joab came into the house to the king. Remember, Joab has been a very loyal servant to this uncle of his. And Joab has been a very loyal nephew. And he puts his own life at risk. But there comes a time when a man must stand up and be a man. When a Christian must stand up and be a Christian and face reality. 5. And Joab came into the house to the king and said, Thou hast shamed this day the faces of all thy servants, which this day have saved thy life. And he could have added, and the lives of thy sons and of thy daughters. That would even be Christ that David carried in his loins through the Virgin Mary. And the lives of thy wives and the lives of thy concubines. I want to go one more verse. In that thou lovest thine enemies and hated thy friends. For thou hast declared this day that thou regardest neither princes nor servants. For this day I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all we had died this day, then it had pleased thee well. Joab saying, Is this what you want the people to see? And we'll pick this up in the next lecture. I don't like to stop at a place like this any more than you do, where the emotions are running high. But thank God for Joab at this time. All right, bless your heart. You listen a moment. I want to share something with you. The companion